All right. Welcome back, everybody. Sorry, I went a little long there, but not to worry. As the semester moves along, we'll be right where we want to be. A lot of material to go through. So let me ask, any questions about anything that I discussed in the lecture portion of our class? Anything come to mind? Okay, well, if not, how soon do the recordings go up? I try to get them up the same night. Sometimes it takes me a day or two, depending on how the conversion process goes over. All right, but last semester, well, not last semester, well, in the spring when I was doing the same thing, I got everything up. I got those up pretty much the same night. You got it. Okay. Let us get into some lab material here. All right. So the lab material is going to, in case you didn't figure it out, lab is going to be mostly anatomy and lecture is going to be mostly physiology. Now, some of them are going to cross over, and you'll see some material being covered in both, which is good because if you're looking at the material twice or three times, it helps to reinforce things. So that's what we're going to be trying to do here, is reinforcement is crucial. Okay, so let's talk about some lab material here. And so a couple things when we're talking about the characteristics of living things, these three items that are listed here: responsiveness, regulation, and reproduction. All right, responsiveness and regulation are very similar to what I was discussing in lecture about homeostasis. And we kind of discussed how when certain stimuli occur, an organism's ability to sense that stimuli and then react to that, because that could be a situation of life or death. Right? So we categorize that as its responsiveness. Regulation, again, very important when we get into the discussion of homeostasis, how well the body is able to maintain its internal stability through the physiological functions that are occurring and also through the actual body form and structure or anatomy. So you can see basically we can say homeostasis is the ability to maintain body anatomy and physiology, because structure is anatomy and function is physiology. So that's what we're going to see there. How well, all right, the body can adjust to internal and even external stimuli and how it can accommodate to any of those environmental changes that occur. Then, of course, like most, all right, biological organisms, reproduction is always going to be a crucial aspect, all right, of our characteristics that we use to describe living things in regards to, for example, all right, cell growth, right, as you're actually growing from a toddler into a child, into a teenager, into an adult, all right, we're going to need to produce new cells, not only for growth, but also if some of those cells get damaged, we need to repair them. And then there's always upkeep, just like having a house. You always have to maintain the house. Well, your body has to maintain itself, all right, through the growth of new cells. And then there's also the other aspect of reproduction in which we are going to want to procreate or basically make new organisms. And so we have our sex cells for that, are our gametes. Men with sperm, women with the oocytes or the eggs. All right, so we already saw this slide, so I'll just quickly glance through it. Again, this is just a reproduction of the levels of organization, basically going from the most simple, the chemical level, to the organismal level, the organism as a whole, us for humans. This picture is wonderful. It explains it wonderfully. So the first several weeks, we are going to be working our way through these basic portions here. All right. Chapter 2 covers atoms and molecules and macromolecules. What's a macromolecule? Proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, fats. All right. And then we're going to get into chapter 4. We're going to talk about cells. And so we're going to talk about the little structures inside the cells, in which we call those organelles. And then when we grab a bunch of cells and throw them together, similar cells, and they start to have a common function, all right, then we've created ourselves tissue. And that's chapter 5. All right, cells are chapter 4. Then when we get into organs and the organ system level, that's going to be just the various chapters. Pretty much after that, we're going to just start to cover different organ systems for the rest of the semester. So we're going to go through, there's a lot to cover. So we're going to go through a lot. So you can see here, all these 11 organ systems of the human body. In Bio 211, 210, we're going to cover the first 4. The integumentary system is the skin. Then there's the skeletal system, our bones, the muscular system, all right, and the nervous system. And so 5 through 11, you'll cover that in Bio 211, okay? So I've got to kind of do some heavy lifting here and work through a lot of the basics and build that foundation with you. All right, these next pictures here are just showing us the different organ systems here that I just described. All right, so we'll work through all those. All right, so let's talk about some basic items so we can have a nice foundation for lab. And in order to do that, I have to talk to you folks about the anatomic position. All right, the anatomic position is what we call a reference position. It's going to allow us to communicate to one another with a general understanding of the position of the body when we have to describe certain things of the human body. So the anatomical position is going to have the person or whatever the model is that we're using in an upright stance. What does that mean? Standing on their feet with their feet flat on the floor and their toes facing forwards. The upper limbs, your arms, are going to be to the sides of your body with your palms facing forward, or the term for front is anteriorly. The term for back is going to be posterior. So we need to start using these anatomical terms. You need to understand them. And if you don't, you're going to have some issues with the class. So I'm going to really urge you to study those terms, and we'll see some of them here in a moment. Finally, the head is level, which means it's looking straight ahead. Okay, it's not looking down towards the floor or up towards the sky, and the eyes are looking forward. That is the anatomical position, or the anatomic position. So now, what we're going to do is, when we have to look at certain structures, or if we want to do certain types of imaging, like MRIs or CT scans, sometimes what we'll have to do is we'll have to take these slices of the body and look at some of the internal structures. So these slices, we call those sections or planes. So we're going to discuss that right now, all right? So we have a section, which is an actual cut. So we cut through the body, and we're going to see some of the internal anatomy there. Our planes are going to be an imaginary flat surface that travel through the body. And so there's a couple here that I want to discuss with you. The first is the coronal, also known as the frontal plane. Now this plane is going to divide us into front or anterior. Okay, it's going to divide us into front and back parts, or anterior and posterior parts. So we're essentially going to chop us straight down the middle there, but front to back. Then we have a transverse or cross-sectional plane. And how I describe this to folks is I tell them, all right, if you've ever seen some magicians or illusionists, when they cut a person in half, well, that's what the transverse plane does. All right, it's a horizontal plane that's going to cut somebody or divide somebody into top and bottom parts, or what we call superior and inferior parts. A couple more planes here. We've got the mid-sagittal or the median plane. Now, this is important that you know this. The mid-sagittal plane is going to divide the body into equal left and right halves. It goes straight down the middle, down through your nose, right down through your sternum, that chest bone there, through your belly button. It'll divide you into equal left and right halves. The sagittal plane will be parallel to the mid-sagittal plane, but it's going to divide the body into unequal parts. And then finally, we have an oblique plane that's going to pass through a structure, body, arm, leg, whatever, at an angle. Normally, it's about a 45-degree angle. I'll show you pictures of this so you can understand it, okay? All right, so here you can see the three major planes here. The coronal plane, all right, is dividing the body into anterior and posterior parts. Your mid-sagittal plane, this guy right here, is going to divide the body into equal right and left halves. And then we've got our transverse plane, this plane right here, all right? That plane is going to divide the body into superior and inferior portions there. And so you can see some of the imaging here is showing you, all right, like when we have a coronal section of the skull, all right, you're seeing, all right, an MRI of the skull here in the coronal plane. The mid-sagittal section here that you can see on this MRI, we've cut the head right in half. And then in the transverse section, we've just taken off the top of your skull. Cut you right through. Here are the eyeballs. Okay? All right, and this is just showing you a three-dimensional structure getting sliced. And this is going to be your large intestine. And you can see how we've kind of just sliced it at different angles. Do transverse and coronal planes give you equal halves like the mid-sagittal? That's a great question, Brittany. No, they don't. All right, mid-sagittal is going to be equal halves. Transverse and coronal will not be. Great, great question. All right. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. Come on, computer. All right. So now what I'd like to do is talk to you about some terminology. And if you've taken medical terminology, then you'll probably know a lot of these words, and that's great. It's going to give you a little bit of a leg up. And this can be a little bit of a nice review. But I'm going to be using certain directional terms here that you need to be familiar with, right? And it's going to be based on everything being in the anatomic position, because remember, that's a reference position. So we're going to use these directional terms to help describe, all right, what's going on in the anatomic position here. And a lot of these terms have what we call opposing pairs. So for example, front and back. Anterior is front, posterior is back. Dorsal and ventral also mean front and back, right? And how I remember that is, if you like sharks, you ever see the fin in the water, like in Jaws? All right, that's called the dorsal fin. And it's on the back of the shark. So ventral's on the front. And then proximal and distal have to do with how close something is to the trunk of your body. All right, we'll go through that. I'll show you some pictures here. So here you can see, and this is found in your book too, okay, in chapter 1. All right, so we have our person standing here in the anatomical position. The arrow is pointing towards the front. That's going to be anterior. The arrow is pointing to the back. That's going to be posterior. And this one here, you can see the arrow is pointing up towards that person's head. So that's going to be superior. And if it's pointing down towards the feet, that will be inferior. Okay. Now what we've done here is we put a mid-sagittal plane right down the center of our model here. And you can see that the arrows are pointing towards the mid-sagittal plane. All right. So that anything that's pointing inwards towards the mid-sagittal plane is going to be medial. Okay. Anything that's moving away from the mid-sagittal plane, going away from the body, is going to be lateral. And then you can see here in this these last two models here, you can see arrows going from the palms of the hand up towards the shoulders. And you can also see these arrows going from the feet towards the hips. That is describing it as being proximal. Remember, anything that moves towards the trunk, here's the trunk. Here's the trunk right here. Anything that moves towards the trunk is going to be proximal. If it moves away from the trunk, you can see these arrows are pointing down away from the hips towards the feet. These arrows are pointing down towards the hands away from the shoulders. That's going to be distal. You heard me in lecture talk about regional anatomy, and it's kind of important because in this class, when we do lecture and lab, mainly for lab, we're going to be studying different regions of the body. And so we divide the skeleton up with regional anatomy, and we divide the muscles up with the regional anatomy. So the two main regions that we're going to talk about are going to be the axial region and the appendicular region. This is a KISS principle moment, meaning let's keep it simple. So this is how I remember it, okay? If you look at this term appendicular, it includes part of the word appendage. And your appendages are your limbs, your arms and your legs. So it's real simple, all right? Your arms and your legs, or your upper and lower limbs, make up the appendicular region. Everything else makes up the axial region. And that includes the head, the neck, and your trunk. So if we go back to the previous slide here, okay, this is part of the regional anatomy. That's the appendicular region. This is also the appendicular region. This is part of the axial region. That's the trunk. This is part of the axial region. That's the head and neck, okay? Just keep it simple. All right, so I'm not gonna go through this term by term because you're gonna do this on your own, and I'm going to expect you to do it over the weekend. So these pictures are in your textbook in chapter 1. And so, yes, we can all say arm, but I don't want you to be saying arm. I want you to say, when we're describing this portion of your upper extremity, the part of your upper extremity between your elbow and your shoulder, that's known as the brachial region. All right. If I want to describe your forearm, the part of your upper extremity between your elbow and your wrist, that's the antebrachial part. If I want to describe the wrist, I'll say the carpal area. So you need to know both of these terms here. Obviously, what's in the parentheses, okay? But what the other term outside of the parentheses means, all right? I'm talking about the armpit. I'm going to be talking about the axillary region. So there's lots of terms here. This is where flashcards would be beneficial, okay? You can buy some flashcards and write forehead on one side and frontal on the other, or you can write cheek on one side and buccal on the other, and that will help you out with that. All right, and here's just some more portions here. All right, I think we're all familiar with the gluteal region because we've heard that before. So some of these terms you're going to know, all right, but some are going to be foreign to you. All right, how many people know when they're talking about the calf that they're talking about the sural region? All right, it can be difficult. All right, so I'm saying that's why it's really important that you take some time to go over some of those terms. All right, let's talk about some body cavities and membranes. We're almost done with some of this lab lecture material here. All right. So in our bodies, we have these cavities. All right. And in these cavities, that's where we're going to keep our organs. The internal organs are going to be found in these cavities or spaces. All right. And so we're going to describe all these cavities. And then in these cavities, we have these membranes. And these membranes are like a liner. It lines these cavities, and it also is going to line the organs that sit inside of these cavities. So we're going to start off by talking about the body cavities. So there's two. You have the posterior aspect and the ventral cavity. Now remember, posterior means back, and ventral, if you remember, is going to be front or anterior. Okay? Front or anterior. I knew I was going to ruin that, but I can't stop now. So let's go over the posterior aspect. I like to do the posterior aspect first because it's simple, it's easy. All right. Fact number one, the posterior aspect is completely surrounded or encased in bone. So that body cavity is going to be surrounded by bone. And so there's two subdivisions to the posterior aspect. All right. You have the cranial cavity, which is made up of the bones that form the top part of your skull, what we call the cranium. And that cavity is where your brain lives. Then the other subdivision of the posterior aspect is called the vertebral canal. And the vertebral canal basically is your spine. Well, I shouldn't say it's not basically your spine, but it's the space inside of your spine. And that's where your spinal cord lives. So the vertebral canal is made up of all the bones that make up your spine, and we call those vertebrae. And when we stack them all on top of one another, we call those the vertebral column. So if you notice something here, the posterior aspect, all right, contains both the brain and the spinal cord. I got to tell you this right now, folks. The brain and the spinal cord, make sure you know this, all right, make up what's known as the central nervous system. Brain and spinal cord. Okay, the CNS. So the central nervous system lives or resides inside of the posterior aspect. And it makes sense then because the central nervous system is vital. It's very important. All right, so wouldn't that make sense to completely surround the central nervous system, all right, with bone because we want to protect it. We don't want anything bad to happen to it. So we're going to do everything in our power to protect it. Okay. So let's move on to the other body cavity. That's the ventral cavity. Remember, ventral is front or anterior. Okay, this is going to be larger than the posterior. It's going to be more towards the front, right? And there's going to be parts of it that are encased by bone and parts of it that aren't. All right, so we subdivide the ventral cavity into the thoracic cavity, which is the superior portion of that. That's your chest. And then we have the abdominal pelvic cavity. That's going to be the inferior portion. Okay, that's going to be your abdomen and your pelvis. All right. So one of the things that I do, let me show you the pictures first. I'll come back to that slide here in a second. All right, so here you can see, all right, here's the posterior aspect. Here's the cranial cavity, all right, and that's surrounded by the cranial bones here that make up the top portion of your skull. Here's where your brain lives. And then you have the vertebral canal, this whole orange area all the way down. And that's surrounded by all the bones of your spine, the vertebrae there. And that's where your spinal cord lives. And you can see the posterior aspect is more towards the back. The ventral cavity is going to be towards the front here. We subdivide the ventral cavity into the top portion or the superior portion, and that's the thoracic cavity. So there are bones that surround the thoracic cavity. And then you can see the bottom of the thoracic cavity is the diaphragm. That's your breathing muscle. All right, that forms the floor of the thoracic cavity. Below that is the abdominal pelvic cavity. Oh, no worries. Thank you for letting me know. I'm glad you're back in. You're here now, and that's what matters. So the abdominal pelvic cavity, oh, no worries, no worries. Do you have a joke that you want to tell? I got a joke for you. Knock, knock. Interrupting cow. All right, anyways. I had a 4-year-old tell me that yesterday in the office, so I thought I'd repeat it to you. Okay, anyways. So the abdominal pelvic cavity, we further subdivide that into 2 smaller cavities. And those smaller cavities are the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. So how do I know where those are? Easy. Put your hands on your hips, on the top of your hip bones there. Anything that's below your hands is going to be in the pelvic cavity. Anything above your hands, all the way up to the thoracic diaphragm, is part of the abdominal cavity. That's simple. We're going to further subdivide the thoracic cavity. I'm just going to mention the names of them, and we'll get into more detail here in a moment. We have the mediastinum, the pleural cavity, and the pericardial cavity. All right, I want you to think of the mediastinum as a column. I have a joke. What has hands but can't clap? A clock. Am I right? Isn't that a riddle? All right. All right, now we're going to end the riddles. I have to think of some. Oh, I got one. Quick joke here. It's completely G-rated. All right. What's the difference between boogers and broccoli? Anyone? Anyone? Well, apparently, neither does a 5-year-old. A 5-year-old will not eat broccoli. That's the difference between boogers and broccoli. A 5-year-old will not eat the broccoli. Mine do too. All righty. So let's jump back into this. All right, so you can see the thoracic thoracic cavity is made up of the mediastinum, which this is this center column structure right here. It's right behind, all right, your sternum, your breastbone there, your chest bone. All right, there's a couple structures we'll talk about what's in the mediastinum. Then lateral to the mediastinum, out to either side, you have, all right, the pleural cavity. These green things. And that is going to be where your lungs reside, in the pleural cavity. And then, of course, you'll see there's a small cavity down here that's in dark blue. That's where the heart lives, and that's the pericardial cavity. All right, we'll get into more detail. Let's get back to, all right, well, I want to jump into, I know I talked about the cavities, but I want to quickly talk about the membranes, the lining of the cavities and the lining of these organs that live in those cavities, okay? So in our cavities here, you will have, all right, the lining called serous membranes. Now, there are 4 types of membranes in the human body, okay? I'm going to go through them real quick here. Okay, so there's 4 membranes. Whoops. All right, the first one is what we're going to study today, and those are the serous membranes. The second one we're going to talk about when we get to chapter 6, the skin. That's the cutaneous membrane. The third one we'll find in chapter 9, that's the synovial membrane. And the last one you'll talk more about in Bio 211, and that is going to be mucus. membranes. Okay, so those are the four membranes that we're going to see in the human body. Okay, so we're going to talk about the serous membranes. All right, so the serous membranes have two layers. And the two layers, all right, that we're going to discuss, all right, I'm going to start with the easier one first. All right, and that's going to be the second one, the visceral layer. And it's easy to remember because here's the thing. Organs. We have another name for organs, and we call the medical term for organs, we call that viscera. So the layer, one of the layers of serous membranes that cover the outside or the external surface of the organs is called the visceral layer, because the visceral layer covers the viscera, which are the organs, and it specifically covers the external surface, okay? The other layer is the parietal layer, and that is going to line the internal surface of the body wall, or the internal surface of that specific cavity. So there's two layers. Well, in between each layer, there's a space there, and we call that the serous cavity. All right, so that's the space in between the two layers. And in that space, all right, we're going to find a fluid or a liquid there. All right, we call that serous liquid. And its job is to act as a lubricant. And you all know what lubricants do, okay? It helps to reduce friction, all right? And it can be friction from movement of the organs. For example, when you're running, right? And your intestines are sloshing around inside your body. If it wasn't for that serous fluid, right, those organs are getting moved around, all right, when they do me a favor, take your hands right now, bring them together, and start rubbing them back and forth really fast. You're going to notice something. Your hands start to heat up, and they heat up because of friction, okay? And when we increase friction, we increase heat. Heat can damage things. Friction can damage things. So the serous fluid helps to reduce that. It's a wonderful thing, and we appreciate it. Well, you might not appreciate it sitting there, but trust me, you should. All right. All right, this is the example. I love this example. Your book does a great job. So basically, how you want to imagine the serous membranes, you're going to take a balloon and you're going to smash your fist into the balloon. And if you notice, let's imagine that your fist is some sort of organ. Let's use your heart, for example, okay? So your fist is your heart, and you'll notice this dark blue line, which was once the outside portion of the balloon until you smashed your fist into it. Now, that dark blue line has become the visceral layer of the serous membrane. Your heart is the viscera. Your fist is the viscera now. It's the heart, okay? That's the organ. So that lining of the balloon right against your hand is the visceral serous membrane. Then the outside of the balloon, that's going to be the parietal layer of the serous membrane. And that's going to line the compartment that your heart is in or the internal body wall surface. And then, of course, you can see there's a space in between these two blue lines, dark blue lines. And that's going to be occupied by air. That's the serous cavity. That's where the serous fluid is going to be present. Okay? Now we're going to get back to the membranes here. Well, actually, I think we're done with the membranes. No, we're not. We're going to come back to the membranes here in a second. I just want to quickly just go back and talk about the mediastinum here and the pericardium and whatnot. We're going to now incorporate both of the body cavities and the serous membranes. So that mediastinum, that was that column-like space I was describing to you. It literally is the median space. Median is directly in the middle. It's the dead center of your body. So it's that median space that sits in the middle of the thoracic cavity. You need to know what lives there, all right? Your heart or part of your heart will be in the mediastinum. You don't know what the thymus is, but it's a gland. It's very important in immune function. That's where your T cells will go and grow up. And that's where 96% of your T cells go to die. All right. And you'll learn more about that in 211. Then you have your esophagus. That's your food tube. That's the tube that connects your throat to your stomach. And then you've got your windpipe. That's your trachea. And then you'll have some of the major blood vessels that go into and out of the heart. For example, your aorta, okay, is one of those major blood vessels. You'll learn more about that in 211 also, okay? So the mediastinum is directly in the center of the thoracic cavity, dead center. All right, so in the thoracic cavity, we also talked about another space called the pericardium, I'm sorry, the pericardial cavity, okay? The pericardial cavity, hold on a second, my brain is not working here. Rewind. All right, the pericardial cavity, all right, is located, let me show you right here. That is where your heart resides, okay? And so the pericardium is the serous membrane. So the visceral pericardium is going to form the outside surface of the heart. Remember, that's that picture where we smash our fist into the balloon, okay? So that visceral pericardium is the heart's external surface. Then the parietal pericardium, which is going to form the sac around the heart, that's the outer layer. That's this blue guy right here. All right, and then that space that we see is the pericardial cavity, and that's going to contain the serous fluid. Now, there are situations in which somebody gets stabbed or they puncture the pericardial sac and blood starts to fill up this space. And that becomes a problem because you know what happens to blood when it's outside of a blood vessel. It starts to coagulate, starts to go from a fluid more like jello. And let me tell you something. Your heart likes to beat inside of jello as much as you like to swim through pudding in a swimming pool. All right? It's tough to do. And your heart doesn't like it. And I know you don't want to swim through pudding unless you're Bill Cosby. Because as you know, Bill Cosby used to do the jello pudding pops commercials. If you're my age or a little bit younger, you'll remember those from the 80s. Okay. Where am I going here? All right. So on to the pleura. The pleura are also another serous membrane, but they surround the lungs. Same thing. You're going to see a pattern here. The visceral pleura right here is going to be the inner layer, and that forms or covers the external surface of the lungs. The parietal pleura is the outer layer, and that's going to line the internal surface of the thoracic wall. And of course, we have a space between those two layers, and that's called the pleural cavity. Of course, that's where our serous fluid is going to be produced. And in the situation, if you've ever heard of a pneumothorax, that's when somebody gets, again, I don't want you to think that I'm fixated on stabbings, but if somebody gets their lung punctured, all right, and it gets the knife or whatever, punctures the parietal pleura, right? Air will rush into the pleural cavity and it'll collapse the lung. Or blood can actually start to fill up that space and it can also collapse the lung. So here you can see some pictures here, all right, of our pleura and our pericardium. All right, so you can see this dark blue line that's immediately surrounding the heart. That's the visceral pericardium. Then you got a light blue area here. That is going to be the pericardial cavity. And then outside that second dark blue line, that's going to be the parietal pericardium. Same thing here for the lungs. Okay, the dark blue line that surrounds the lungs immediately is the visceral pleura. And then the dark blue line on the outside, which is going to line the internal thoracic wall, that's the parietal pleura. And then the light blue in between is the pleural cavity. And that's the cavity that will fill up with blood or air if we puncture the lung. All right, one more body cavity that I want to talk about is going to be the abdominal pelvic cavity, and we subdivide that into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Remember, the abdominal cavity is the top portion or the superior portion. This is going to house most of your digestive system, your kidneys, and the ureters. The ureters are the tubes that connect the kidneys to the urinary bladder. The pelvic cavity is going to be the bottom portion or the inferior area. That's going to sit in between your hip bones, and that's going to contain the remainder, the more distal portion of your digestive system, the large intestine, the rectum. All right. You'll also see the bottom portion of the ureters as they connect to the urinary bladder that sits down in the pelvic area. And you're going to see some of the internal reproductive organs. Like for females, that's where you'll find the uterus, that's where you'll find the ovaries. And for the males, that's where you're going to find the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles. All right, that will be in the pelvic cavity. So of course, we have a serous membrane lining there too. And we call that the peritoneum. All right, that's the name of the serous membrane lining of the abdominal pelvic cavity. And it's the same scenario. The visceral peritoneum is going to cover all of the abdominal and pelvic organs, and it's going to form the external surface. All right, or I shouldn't say it's going to form that. Let me rephrase that. It's going to cover the external surface there. All right, the outer layer, all right, that's going to line the internal walls of the abdominal pelvic cavity. And then, of course, in between the two layers, there's the peritoneal space, or excuse me, the peritoneal cavity. Now, this is important. It's a potential space. Okay, so normally that space doesn't exist except under certain circumstances. Then it becomes a potential space. For example, if you have internal bleeding and you get blood trapped in between the parietal and the visceral peritoneum, then that peritoneal cavity is no longer a potential space. It's an actual space that blood is filling up. All right. So you can see here in our sagittal cut, all right, you can see all the different organs. The dark blue line here that's covering these organs, that is going to be the visceral peritoneum. And then this dark blue line here that's lining the internal abdominal wall there and pelvic cavity, that's going to be the parietal peritoneum. And then the light blue is actually representing the peritoneal cavity. All right, that's a potential space. All right, let's just finish up here with just our abdominal pelvic regions and quadrants here. So there's two ways in which we can map out the abdominal pelvic area. Okay, the first way is using the regions here. And we divide that into 9 compartments. And it all centers around your belly button right here. So we're going to create a tic-tac-toe board, and our center square, all right, is going to surround your belly button. And so we name the center square the umbilical region. Okay, that surrounds your umbilicus or your belly button or navel. So if we go up here, all right, above the umbilical region, we go to the epigastric region. That's going to be superior to the umbilical region. We call that the epigastric region because this is your stomach right here. All right, and the majority of that region is above the stomach. So above, we use epigastric. So then we go down here to the hypogastric region, and we call that the hypogastric region because it's way below the stomach. So below is hypo. Okay. So now let's move back to this page here, and you can see on either side of the epigastric region, all right, we have the left and right hypochondriac regions. Now, we don't describe it, we don't name it after a person that thinks they have every disease known to man and thinks they're always sick. And yes, I know that's a hypochondriac, but this is in reference to the costal cartilages, which are the cartilages that you can see here on the ribs. Okay. And so we call that the left and right hypochondriac region. We drop back down to the umbilical region. You'll notice on either side of the umbilical region, you have the left and right lumbar regions. That's easy. We call that the lumbar region because right here is the low back. your low back of your spine is called the lumbar spine. So the left and right lumbar regions are to either side of that area. And then finally, all right, the last two quadrants that are left are the right and left iliac regions. Well, we name those because they occupy the areas around your hip bone. And the top part of your hip bone, at one point, your hip bone is made up of 3 bones. They all fuse together. Well, the top bone is called the iliac bone. So we name those regions after that. So that's called the right and left iliac regions. So the abdominal pelvic regions are okay for labeling, but I like the quadrants because it's simple. Because what do we do with the quadrants? We draw 2 lines, an X and a Y axis, right directly through the umbilicus. And then we name it, right, based on the anatomical position. The right side of our screen is this person. This is that person's left arm, and this is the person's right arm because they're facing us. Right? So obviously, right upper quadrant is going to be here, and the left lower quadrant will be here. Right lower quadrant's over here, left upper quadrant's over here. It's that simple. All right, let's do a little bit of labeling. So what is labeling? Well, that's when you're going to get out your lab atlas. If you have it, not to worry. Once you get it, you can watch this video and do some of the labeling, all right, from the video. All right, so we're going to do some labeling here to kind of give our brains a moment to rest and not work too hard. We have a few minutes before class ends, so I want to get some of the labeling out of the way. All right. So you want to see what the anatomical position looks like? There it is. Okay. Head is looking straight ahead. Eyes are looking straight ahead. All right. Feet flat on the floor. Feet are pointing towards us. All right. Arms are down to the side with the palms facing anteriorly. That's the anatomical position. That's our reference point. So you're looking at this person like you're talking to this person, having a conversation. So my right hand is going to be on the same side as this person. Excuse me, go back. All right, my right side is going to be this person's left side. And this person's right side will be my left side as I'm facing them. So when you hear me say anatomical right and anatomical left, it's always in reference to the model, the thing that you're looking at. Okay, that's going to be important when you're labeling certain structures. All right, so here's the anatomical position. Now we're going to talk about different positions that you can be in. If you've been in the military, all right, and you've had to do push-ups, this is the prone position. Sometimes it's referred to as the front leaning rest position, but this is basically you laying on your face. Face down is the prone position. The next type of position is you laying on your back. That's the supine position. How I always remembered that is I'm laying on my spine in the supine position. Okay, supine position, you're laying on your back. All right, so let's talk about some of those planes that I was discussing with you earlier. Here you can see the coronal or the frontal plane. All right, we've taken this plane and we've divided the body into anterior and posterior parts. All right, it's going to cut you down the front, all right, and divide you into front and back portions there. The next plane is the transverse or cross-sectional plane. This is the one in which we cut you from, all right, when we saw you in half. So you have a superior portion and an inferior portion. That's the transverse or cross-sectional plane. And this other one here is the mid-sagittal plane. You can see it goes directly down the center of the body and it will divide you into equal right and left halves, mid-sagittal. Whereas a sagittal plane, all right, the sagittal plane does not divide you into equal right and left halves. You can see how it is unequal. That's a sagittal plane. And then last is our oblique plane. And that just cuts through you at a specific angle. Normally it's 45, but it can be 67, all right, or 80 degrees in which the oblique plane travels through your body. All right, here you can see all the different planes. We've already seen something like that before. All right, we've already gone through this. We'll skip this. All right, this is just, and again, this is an old table from the second edition from your book, but this is in chapter 1, okay? And it has all the different, all right, anatomical directional terms, and it gives you easy ways to understand it. All right, so anterior, in front of, all right, toward the front surface. The stomach is anterior to the spinal cord. All right, so you can, I would suggest that you look over these terms in these tables over the weekend, these pictures too. Look over these pictures and start to make maybe some flashcards or whatever method that you want to do. We'll skip through this because I want to get to the labeling portion. Yeah. We've seen all this. All right, last one. There we go. Okay, so thyroid cartilage, all right, is going to be the first, all right, identifying term that we're going to use. Again, this model is facing us. Now, I'm not sure which pages these are on because it jumps all over the lab manual, all right? So that's why you have the recording here. You can go back in forth, all right? Some of these models are going to be like on page 2 or 3 or 4, and then you'll find some on like page, I don't know, I can't remember if it was like 60 something or whatever. You just got to kind of do a little bit of flipping through the pages here. All right, so the thyroid cartilage is this blue structure. All right, so understand that cartilage, especially this type of cartilage, which is made up of, it's called hyaline cartilage. It's the type of cartilage is going to appear blue. Okay, so right below the thyroid cartilage is the thyroid gland. All right, you know, we can tell it's the gland because there's lots of blood vessels going to the gland. And we'll learn later on that cartilage is what we call avascular. I need to rephrase that. Mature cartilage is avascular, which means there's no blood supply that goes to the cartilage. So a nice way to tell the difference between the thyroid gland and the thyroid cartilage is if there's blood vessels going to something, it's a gland. It's not the cartilage. And for the most part, if it's a blue tube, it's a vein. If it's a red tube, it's an artery. Not all the time, but for this class, go with that. Okay, if it's blue or red, and it's a tube structure, it's most likely a blood vessel. Okay, so let's get into the respiratory area here. This tube that this arrow is pointing to is the trachea. It is also known as the windpipe. Do not write that down. All right, you will be marked wrong. It is the trachea. Okay, so the trachea divides here, all right, into 2 branches. So the branch here on our left is the right primary bronchus, because remember, we are looking at the front part of this model. So this is like somebody looking in and facing us, like you're talking to them, all right? So that's the right primary bronchus. And then on the other side is the left primary bronchus. You need to be able to differentiate left and right. You have to tell me that. If you leave that off and just write primary bronchus, you get half credit. I need you to be specific, okay? Left and right primary bronchus. If you notice, the left primary bronchus is more horizontal. Horizontal is this way, all right? The right primary bronchus is more vertical. Vertical is up and down. So if you swallow something, most likely it's going to go down into the right primary bronchus because it's more vertical. All right, so you can see over here, we're looking at our model. It's facing us. So our left side is this model's right side. So that's the right lung. And then if we go to the next slide, we will see the left lung, all right, which is on our right side. Be specific, don't lose points that way. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to show you part of the digestive system. This is the tube that connects your throat to your stomach. We call that the esophagus. Down here, this is the stomach. Over here, that's the liver. We'll label that in a second. So there's the esophagus. We're going to see the esophagus here in a different way. So now we're looking at the model. We've actually removed the heart from this model, okay? And so the esophagus sits behind the heart. Now you have a blue tube here, a red tube here. Here's that red tube back here, okay? That's the aorta. Remember what I said, if it's a tube-like structure and it's red or if it's blue, it's a blood vessel, okay? In this scenario, on this model, all right, we're looking at, I don't know what color that is, peach, orange, kind of, all right? So it's not a blood vessel, okay? That is the esophagus. Here's the trachea up here. And then the trachea splits off into the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus. The esophagus is posterior to the trachea, all right? It sits behind there. All right, there's the heart. Now you can see how the heart sits in between the left and right lungs. It sits more off to the left side. And so you can see there's a little bit of like an indentation here. That's called the cardiac notch, okay, where it kind of presses into the left lung there. So now we'll see the heart all by itself. There it is. You're going to learn all these structures in chapter 19 in the cardiovascular system in 211. But for right now, you just need to know that's the heart. And this right here is your breathing muscle. It's the diaphragm. We're going to go into more detail about it and once we get into the muscle chapter. But for right now, this is the floor of your thoracic cavity. The red part is the muscle portion of the diaphragm. This white part is the tendon. We call that the central tendon. All right, for this test, for lab test 1, you don't need to know that. The only thing you need to know is that this structure is called the diaphragm. We're going to learn all these holes later on. All right, now you can see the diaphragm in our model, and you can see above it, here's the thoracic cavity. And then below it is the abdominal pelvic cavity down here. So the diaphragm makes up the floor of the thoracic cavity. That's what your lungs and your heart actually will rest on top of. There's the liver. Take notice on our model here, the liver is off to the right side of the body. It's the largest internal organ, but it rests and sits off to the left side, or excuse me, the right side of the body. Here it is all by itself. All right, when you do the digestive system in chapter 26, you will learn all the other parts. The only other structure that you have to know in this picture is that green sac-like structure, which we're going to see here in a moment. There's the liver on the right side of the body. The stomach is more on the left side of the body. But you can see they're pretty much at the same level. There's that green-like structure. That's the gallbladder. Gallbladder is going to store bile, and it helps to concentrate the bile. It does not, let me repeat myself, the gallbladder does not make bile. The liver does. And then the liver puts it into the gallbladder, and it gets stored in the gallbladder. All right, this structure right here is the stomach. The stomach is a J-shaped organ. It's got one way in and one way out. The top portion up here is the entrance to the stomach. So food travels down the esophagus and it goes into the stomach here. And so that top opening there, we have to close it off every once in a while. And so we utilize the cardiac sphincter to do that. The cardiac sphincter closes off the entrance to your stomach. So no more food comes in, or hopefully no food will leave through that way. All right, here comes the exit. That's the pyloric sphincter. That's down here. That's where food will leave the stomach and go into the small intestine. Okay, so the pyloric sphincter is going to be an area that can contract and close up. All right, now you notice inside the stomach, we have these wrinkles here. Those wrinkles are called rugae, all right, or ridges. And so as the stomach starts to fill up, it'll start to distend, and those ridges, those rugae, will start to flatten out. You can fit quite a bit of food and liquid into the stomach. My friend had their gallbladder removed. Does it do anything harmful if you don't have one? No, it just makes digesting fatty foods a lot more difficult. Bile helps to break down fatty foods. It helps to what we call emulsify fat, which is almost kind of like liquefying the fat as we digest it. So I've got a good friend of mine, actually a couple friends of mine have had their gallbladders removed. And so my one friend has to be very careful. Yeah, food doesn't last long, because with him, if he eats a particularly fatty meal, I am not lying to you, I would say less than 30 to 20 minutes, he's in the bathroom. And it's just because, you know, the gallbladder is not, you still are producing the bile and your liver is excreting it, but it doesn't have it in a decent or an adequate amount on hand. So it just makes digesting those fatty foods a lot more difficult. And you just have to go to the bathroom more. You can live without it, but it's just not the same. So here's our stomach. Here's the external view of the stomach, and here's our internal view of the stomach here. All right, almost done for today. So once we get to the stomach and we leave the stomach, we get to the small intestine. And the small intestine is made up of 3 parts. So the first part, and that's what we see over here, that's the duodenum, also known as the duodenum. No, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have gallbladder issues. Gallbladder issues, you can experience pain right around the liver, so it'll be like along the right side there. For whatever reason, the gallbladder, well, not for whatever reason, I'll explain this reason later on. But the gallbladder, if there's something wrong with the gallbladder, you can start to experience pain in your right shoulder on the back portion there. You'll see that your stools, when you're going to the bathroom, you'll have fatty stools, and how do you know if you have fatty stools? Your stool will float more, and it'll have more of a, I won't say a tan appearance there, but it'll have a higher fat content. And it's just like, and I hate to say this, more obese people or fatty people, it's easier for them to float in water. Well, the same thing is kind of holds true for your stools there. But it does, just because they're going number 2 or defecating more often doesn't necessarily mean that they have gallbladder issues. It could be a whole list of things. They could have pancreatic issues. They could have malabsorption issues going on. I know some folks that if they take a lot of antacids, they're getting inappropriate digestion and absorption of their food, and that can cause issues there. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a gallbladder issue. So there's that first portion of the small intestine. That's the duodenum there. No, well, yes, I'm glad I could be of help. That's my job. I love it when you folks ask me questions. All right, so we're going to see on a different model. Here's also the duodenum, and you can see here in the duodenum, we've removed part of it, and so we can see in the inside, you can see it has these these ridges there, and those are called, you don't need to know that for this class, but those are called plicae circularis, and they're just speed bumps. It helps to kind of mix the food, and it kind of slows down the passage of food through the small intestine, so you have more time to absorb the nutrients. That's our goal. All righty. The second portion of the small intestine is called the jejunum. And that's usually right here in the middle portion, right in through here. And then the final portion of the small intestine is known as the ileum. That's spelled I-L-E-U-M. That's ileum. And that's down here towards the end. Hey, baby girl. Okay, we're going to stop here for today because you folks have been subjected to me long enough. All right. So one of the things that I quickly, and I'll let you go, this will take me less than 2 minutes, that I wanted to show you because I can't remember off the top of my head if I did show you this, is, this needs to go away. All right, let me shut this off here really quick. Okay. Why are you taking so long? Oh, Lord, I don't know why this is not going away. Of course, as soon as I want to show you something, this happens. Give me 1 second here. All right, thank you. Preview ended. All right, real quick. One of the things I definitely want to show you is some of the course content here for lab material. So obviously you'll go into a lab folder, either lab exam 1, 2, 3, or 4. All right, so you'll click on that. And you'll scroll down to the bottom, and we have general body plan identification review and integument identification review. All right. And so you'll click onto these, and it's a soft chalk lesson. And I said this in the announcement, in which you can do drag and drop exercises. So you'll look for a term, all right, right long, I'll drag it over to this spot here, boom, drop it in. And then left lung, drop it over here. And you can start labeling your atlas that way if you would like. Okay, good, good, good. I'm glad you're back, Elizabeth. Again, if you missed anything, just watch the video for the part that you missed and you'll be able to catch up on anything. So this is, again, one of the different resources that you can use. It helps with folks just trying to practice on how to label things. And we also have these what we call review lab exams. We used to call them mock exams. We call them review lab exams. They don't count for anything, all right? But it's a great way, if you want to know what these lab exams are going to be like, take these review lab exams. You can take them as many times as you want, all right? And so all you're going to do is just click on it. It'll ask you to start the test, begin, all right? And then you can take it as many times as you would like. And these exams, these review lab exams, are actually much more strict in the way that they grade. So if you do really well on the review lab exam, most likely you're going to do well on our actual exams. Will there be labs where we will have graded assignments during the Zoom? No. You won't be having graded assignments during the Zoom, okay? That's just going to be where I'm going to be talking about presenting more of the lab material to you. But there will be no graded assignments during the Zoom. Yes, good. Let's get rid of that anxiety. Anxiety, be gone. All right, I feel like, oh, and then also, as we go down, we do have lab study guides too, if you want to use them. And there are more videos. All right, so if you click on to this video here, it's going to be Dr. Pernitzer. She has some lab identification videos. So if you want to use those, you can do that. All right, you can use my YouTube channel, or you can go here and use some of those videos here. All right, I apologize. I feel like I've taken up so much of your time. I'm sorry, but not sorry, because it's my job. I have to show you all this. So if there's any questions, ask away. But if you don't have any questions, you are more than welcome